Preksha, you could begin now. We are live.
Thank you, Richa. Good afternoon and welcome to the special lecture on day 2 of the 14th All India Conference of China Studies, organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies and China Bhavan Vishwa Bharati University in partnership with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Frank Pieke to deliver the special lecture on the topic Governance, Culture and Superpower in the Transformation of Chinese Communist Party Rule. Professor Frank Pieke is Professor of Modern China Studies at Leiden University, Leiden. He is also the co-founder and the first executive director of the Leiden Asia Center. Between 2018 and 2020, he was the director of the Mercator Institute of China Studies in Berlin. And this year, he is in Uppsala as a fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study. As chair for this session, we are joined by Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, former Ambassador of India to China, Bhutan, and Pakistan. Currently, Ambassador Bambawale is a distinguished professor at Symbiosis International University, Pune, and Adjunct Fellow AICCS. Before I hand over the floor to Ambassador Bambawale to begin the proceedings, let me lay out the housekeeping rules. All participants except the speakers will be muted for the duration of the event. Participants are requested to send in their queries via the chat box or the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself and please unmute only when called upon to do so by the chair. I will now invite Ambassador Gautam Bambawale to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Preksha. And let me start by welcoming Professor Frank Pieke himself for this 14th All India Conference on China Studies, and for this special lecture on governance, culture, and superpower in the transformation of Chinese Communist Party rule. We are meeting, of course, and we are here to listen to Professor Frank Pieke's lecture after the immediate aftermath of the 6th plenary session of the 19th Central Committee, which ended after a 4-day meeting just yesterday. There's a lot of material which is already coming out on what happened at that particular meeting, including a resolution on the history of the Communist Party of China. But I think what is most significant is the fact that you have a new leader in China, or you have an old leader in China, has been there for the past 9 years now, who is in the mold of Mao Zedong. He is centralizing political power in his own self in the way that Mao Zedong experienced. And whether that is good or bad for China is anyone's guess. In my opinion, I think that is bad for China, because we know that history shows, and this is part of the history resolutions of the Communist Party of China, that there were certain mistakes which were made by even the great helmsman Mao Zedong himself. Whether Xi Jinping is going to make similar kind of mistakes, we will have to wait and see. But it is quite obvious that he is set to lead China for a much longer stint than most recent general secretaries of the Communist Party of China. He is likely to get an extension, a third period when he can be general secretary at next year's party congress, the 20th party congress. But to put all of this together and to look at history, to look at the present, and to look to the future, we're all indeed delighted to have Professor Frank Pieke with us. And Professor, we're all ears. We'd like you to listen to you before we come back to you with more queries, questions, maybe even some comments. So the floor is yours, Professor.
Well, thank you very much for these kind introductions, both of you. I'm also very pleased to be at your conference again. I was at this conference, I think 2 years ago in Goa, when we could still all meet in person. And it's, it's difficult to do this online through Zoom, but on the other hand, it is also much more convenient. You can invite many more people that normally would not come. So there's a little bit of good in what is overall a pretty bad situation. What I'll present to you is part of a book that I'm currently working on, that looks at the transformation of China into a superpower, but in a different way than it's normally done. What people normally do is to say what China, or to look at what China does to us being the rest of the world. What does a superpower do? How does it compete with other superpowers? And how can we prepare for this challenge? I actually want to turn it around and see what being a superpower or becoming a superpower means for the superpower itself. How does a country change because of the challenges, because of the needs of superpower and superpower competition? And that is something that is relatively understudied. There's a little bit of work about the United States, of course, about, for instance, national security and national security legislation and infrastructure. But it's usually not squarely taken on what superpower more generally means for a society. So that is what the book wants to do. And the presentation today focuses in particular on the role of culture and of history, and also a little bit of religion, but that latter part I don't have time to go into. So my aim is to arrive at a deeper understanding of how the Chinese Communist Party's modalities of rule adapt to China's status as an emerging superpower. This will enable a better assessment of the robustness and longevity of the regime and of the impact superpower-driven changes have on China's behavior as an international player. And this is important because many of the things that are changing in the Chinese Communist Party in particular look like a return to old ways, but actually it is a profound transformation that uses old tools and old ideas for completely new purposes. So you have this overlay of Maoism and Maoist behavior, but actually it serves completely different purposes, and it's actually a completely different thing. So that is really what I want to understand better. So I will limit myself here to the main features and dynamics of one dimension of superpower in China, namely the Communist Party's quest to seek perpetual dominance. So I won't talk about national security that much. The evolution of China into a vibrant, free and open society triggered a mounting response from the CCP to reassert control. Perceiving vibrancy as corruption, freedom as chaos and openness as exposure to foreign threats, the CCP set out much more directly to dominate and rule Chinese society, and to set its dominance on a stronger and more lasting footing. But dominance has been the party's game all along. So what's different? The party's own organization and organizational culture have, first of all, been expanded and tightened. Emphasizing loyalty and obedience over critical thinking and innovation, the party's members and cadres are trained and educated, disciplined, and if needed, punished and purged to ensure full uniformity to the party center's demands. Although originally not necessarily so intended, this renewed emphasis on the party by the mid-2010s merged with the current leadership's singular focus on national unity and national strength, on international prestige and great power competition with the US. The power of the central leadership, and especially of Xi Jinping himself, is felt much more directly and uniformly all across the country, while the room for local improvisation and policy adjustment continues to shrink. Most importantly, the party assumes direct responsibility for government. No longer content to be a chess player controlling the game from up high, the party has now stepped onto the chessboard, involving itself directly in governance. The party has also taken a much harder look at itself. Party building, as it's called, has been stepped up in order to maintain what the party considers to be its own unique nature. Party building is, and this is a set phrase, how the party must manage the party, bringing together ideology, organization, and political practice. The key aspect of this approach is the principle of, again, a set phrase, strictly governing the party in order to enhance the party's organizing power, to strengthen the political function of party branches, and to develop the party's role of a battle fortress, again, a set phrase, in the consolidation of the party's long-term governance. Now, this started way before Xi Jinping. with Hu Jintao essentially, but Xi Jinping further increased the direct political and administrative role of the party and strengthened its presence and grip on government, the army, the judicial system, civil society, business, and especially the party itself. Xi also put an end to enhancing inner party democracy, which had been an important aspect of Hu Jintao, strengthening of the party's capacity. Under Xi, the party became the instrument of the central leadership to roll out their vision and policies without any particular pretension of representing anything else at all. Instead, the new party constitution of 2017 simply proclaims that, and this is a quote, the party leads on everything. The centre's top-level design of policy and governance formulates central blueprints that are systematically rolled out throughout the system of government and the party. This technocratic vision is supposed to replace the structurally fragmented policymaking and implementation process of old, where central policies were adapted to, or even countered, to suit local circumstances. Meanwhile, Xi's immensely popular anti-corruption campaign has been thoroughly institutionalized and turned into a permanent feature of party rule. Party discipline and party supervision now pervade the entire administration. Persecution of corrupt individuals reaches the highest levels, including members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo itself. So the party has created a new infrastructure of comprehensive dominance revolving around law-based governance, performance-based audit and surveillance, and top-level design, putting the party on an unprecedentedly solid footing. This, however, is only the most visible aspect of the transformation of the CCP under the impact of China's rising superpower status. As Franz Schumann so many decades ago already taught us, a communist party rules not just through its organization, but also, and perhaps more importantly, through its ideology. I will argue that this aspect of CCP dominance might be the more important one, because it extends party legitimacy from mere overt ideological pronouncements to penetrate deep into Chinese culture and even into religion. This effort amounts to what I would like to call the naturalization of CCP legitimacy. The CCP's legitimacy can no longer be pigeonholed as socialist, nationalist, developmentalist, or even as just good governance. Nor is the party's chief concern avoiding unrest or dissent. The party is rebranding itself deliberately as the heir, guardian, and embodiment of the Chinese nation and Chinese civilization, aiming to establish a foundation to its rule that is unquestionable and perpetual. That latter is really important. The party's stated mission has become extremely general, anodyne even. In the words of the communiqué, the sixth plenum of the CCP issued yesterday that was already briefly alluded to, quote, since its founding in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party has always regarded the happiness of the Chinese people and the revival of the Chinese nation as its original mission. Now, this is one of the grossest misreadings and distortion of history that I've ever encountered. I thought there was something about class struggle and about the proletariat in the original mission. I don't see it now. Weaving together the strands of ideological innovation, the production of an excellent Chinese culture, important stock phrase again, and the construction of a patriotic and revolutionary tradition, CCP legitimacy is forming a fabric that will prove more difficult to unravel with each passing year. The reorientation of the party away from a straightforward focus on development and prosperity started in 2002 and 2003 with a subtle re-engineering of Jiang Zemin's theory of the three represents that had made it the party's mission to represent the development of what was called the advanced social productive forces. After Chiang's departure in 2002, this elitist and revisionist sting of the three represents was carefully removed by shifting the emphasis to the party's role to represent the fundamental interests of the greatest majority of the Chinese people, so no longer the advanced productive forces. The main thrust of the reassertion of Marxism and socialism that followed was the diagnosis that foreign influences and the individualism, religion, and materialism that had grown under the reforms challenged the party's ideological leadership. Moreover, simply basing CCP leadership on performance in the economic sphere would be risky, as high economic growth could not be sustained indefinitely. And mind you, this was in 2004, so there was still more than a decade to go of high economic growth, but already then they were preparing for its eventual end. Ideological renewal would be essential for the Chinese people, again, to coalesce around the party and to strengthen the cohesion and unity of the Chinese nation. In order to make that happen, CCP ideology had to become more tangible and realistic, presenting concrete ideas on how to address the needs of the people instead of just being an abstract and faraway ideal. Marxism and socialism had to become a living and developing ideology, capable of adapting to changing circumstances and accommodating a range of interests and ideas. This development of CCP ideology took on a more concrete form in the concept, well-known concept of the scientific outlook on development. However, ideological innovations of the CCP not merely enlisted science as the foundation. In the redirection of Chang's Re3% that I just talked about, Confucian terms like people-centered development and harmonious society began to feature very prominently. China's traditional culture and religion had witnessed a revival in Chinese society in the 1990s and 2000s already, as a reaction against the materialism and foreign values of modern lifestyle. Things like national studies, Confucian education, morality and self-cultivation, and Taoist, Buddhist, and other religious practices all stayed to come back, quite often as an alternative to the rapid spread of mainly Protestant Christianity. Also, Chinese public intellectuals started promoting Confucian concepts like all under heaven or benevolent rule as alternatives to Western ideas in international politics. Ironically, often inspired by the new Confucianism among prominent intellectuals abroad, like Du Weiming, and the example of Singapore as a society based on reinvented and utterly artificial Asian values. The CCP's turn to traditional Chinese culture was therefore very much in tune with the times. More than any other aspect of traditional Chinese culture or religion, Confucianism lends itself very well to the purposes of the CCP. Confucian values and practices legitimize the exercise of state power for the benefit of the people, but remain quite agnostic about the type of political system or the type of regime, as long as it's benevolent and just. So Confucianism's lack of transcendence, revealed truths or absolute goals, have over the millennia allowed a succession of reinterpretations that in turn have been enlisted for many political purposes. Despite its malleability and explicit support for authority, hierarchy, rule and order, the CCP has taken care to box in Confucianism as much as possible. Confucianism as such has never been included in the CCP's orthodoxy. Instead, it has been dealt with as a part of a sanitized traditional Chinese culture, from which a select few elements were incorporated into the CCP's own core socialist values, such as civility, harmony, justice, integrity, and friendliness, all real socialist hardcore values. Adapting, as Xi Jinping put it in his speech at the 100th anniversary of the CCP, the basic tenets of Marxism to China's specific realities and its fine traditional culture. Again, fine traditional culture is a stock phrase that comes back time and again. Under Xi Jinping, ideological renewal has been further stepped up. Many of the ideas developed under Hu Jintao have remained in place, but they have been made more explicit and have been systematized. The cultural turn in CCP ideology has become more pronounced. The party has returned to the fundamental questions of a century ago about how China ought to respond to the challenge of Western imperialist encroachment. The CCP, like so many other parties, rulers and intellectuals and other groups around that time, so a century ago, incorporated two diametrically opposed answers to this question. The first was a radical rejection of Chinese culture as sick, corrupt, and no match for the West. A new culture had to be established that was informed by a selection of Western ideas that were thought to hold the key to the vigor and power of the West. The other approach was quite different. Accepting that China was weak and under acute threat of national extinction, again, a stock phrase, national extinction, its culture nevertheless was its essence, containing many elements worth preserving in the preparation of the nation for competition with other, currently much more powerful countries. An invigorated but authentic Chinese culture would give the country strength, cohesion, and affluence as a modern, powerful nation able to stand up against its oppressors. Now, the CCP is, of course, best known for the first of the two answers to China's problem. China's problem, again, a stock phrase. Iconoclasm and the adoption of foreign ways were as much at the heart of Maoist revolution as they were at the heart of Dengist reforms. Yet cultural conservatism as an avenue towards modernity and national redemption has always been present in the party's ideology and also in the party's practice, if only in the form of Mao's insistence that China was uniquely predestined to become the greatest and most socialist country in the world. In the 1980s and 1990s, so-called neoconservatism developed an influential critique of all-out market reform and materialism as socially disruptive, ultimately weakening China, undermining its unique culture and socialist institutions, and turning it eventually into a palette copy of the West. After the second phase of reform under Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji in the 1990s, this cultural conservatism re-emerged. Of particular importance here is the figure of Wang Huning, who has continued to work at the CCP's center under no less than three different general party secretaries, namely Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping, since 1995. In 2017, he became China's fifth most powerful man when he was elevated to the Standing Committee of the CCP Politburo, despite never having held a political executive office in his life. Wang sees the party and the nation as under threat of US and Western infiltration, and the word infiltration is used specifically here. The main way of countering this would be to construct a strong Chinese culture. Sounds familiar, right? That informs a reinvigorated socialist ideology. To Wang, as one of the highest leaders of the land, however, reconstructing Chinese culture is therefore no more a matter of just national salvation, but of enhancing national security and party dominance. So it's statist and partyist. Western ideological infiltration through the promotion of democracy, human rights, and civil society are seen as an acute threat to the supremacy of the party and the perpetuation of socialism in China. There is, according to Wang, therefore a need to strengthen China's assertiveness and confidence in its system, theory, path, and culture, which are the so-called four confidence, 四个自信, both domestically and in China's relations with other countries. Ideology has also been drawn into the orbit of national security. Under Xi, the so-called overall national security outlook has evolved into an all-of-government approach to prepare China for an extremely wide range of domestic and foreign threats. Explicitly including ideology in this outlook of national security has important implications. As a constituent part of the system of national security, ideological security refers to the situation wherein the state's dominant ideology is relatively secure and free from internal and external threats. Ideological security guarantees that the mainstream ideology is dominant and exercises a guiding, cohesive, and controlling power over various other strands of social thought. So they're not suppressed, but they're just simply controlled. Ideological security as part of overall national security this primarily refers to the effects ideology has on other security fields and the role it plays in ensuring our political legitimacy and providing an effective defense of the system and the regime. Ideological security strengthens a common spirit amongst the people. So it enhances social stability and progress and enhances also preparedness for ideological security threats. Now, what is meant by ideological threats, ideological security threats, has been shown by the very recent crackdown on China's booming popular culture industry and some of its most prominent icons. Last summer, the so-called Common Prosperity campaign suddenly burst into the scene. The campaign is intended to reduce the gap between rich and poor and create both material and spiritual wealth. Now, tech billionaires and the private tutoring industries were its chief targets, and they were condemned for greed and a lack of morality. Other victims, however, included celebrities and their fan cultures that were condemned as having lost touch with the needs and lives of the people and China's traditional culture. Especially offended city stars were denounced for fake and ugly values and deformed aesthetics out of touch with the needs of the common people. I always find it very interesting that you denounce it is out of touch with the common people, whereas these people, these city stars, so-called city stars, have a massive fan following. Perhaps the party is out of touch with what the common people are. Perhaps the common people are all sissy stars, wannabe sissy stars, but that's something they don't want to entertain, obviously, as a thought. Now, the Common Prosperity campaign was quite suddenly politicized by the publication and dissemination of an essay by Li Guangman, a little-known member of China's New Left that had otherwise carefully been kept out of the political mainstream. In his essay, Li Guangman saw an impending profound revolution taking place in China that, and I quote, it's a long quote, but it's interesting, so it's worth it. A revolution taking place in China that marks a return from capitalist cliques to the people. All those who obstruct this people-centered transformation will be left behind. That's a threat, right? This profound transformation also marks a return to the original intent of the Chinese Communist Party and a return to the essence of socialism. The culture market will no longer be a paradise for nymphomaniac stars, and news and public opinion will no longer be in a position for worshipping Western culture. Red will return, heroes will return, blood will return. We need to control all cultural chaos and build a lively, healthy, masculine, strong, and people-oriented culture. Now, obviously, this Li has been so heavily taking his Kool-Aid and probably should see a psychiatrist, but nevertheless, he's become very influential. Li's essay was almost immediately condemned by Hu Xijin, the editor-in-chief of the notorious Global Times. The Global Times and Hu Xijin are faithful mouthpieces of the CCP's central messages, and they are normally anything but shy to denounce Western meddling or domestic liberalism. Hu, whilst not taking issue with Li Guangman's observation that problems exist with the monopolies and excessive wealth, he criticizes Li that Li insists that these can and are being dealt with in a series of recent market supervision measures that do not amount to revolution across the full spectrum of the economic, financial, culture, and political fields. Now, there's much that is puzzling and alarming about the exchange between Li and Hu. Unlike Li's essay, Hu's rejection of Li's view was not disseminated by the official media, although one would normally expect Hu to represent the position of the party center. An open call like Li's for a revolution in which bourgeois decadence and cultural elitism explicitly are connected can only remind one of Mao's Cultural Revolution. As we all know, the Cultural Revolution quickly turned against the party itself, hardly the kind of thing that Xi Jinping and his fellow leaders would wish to unleash upon themselves. So it's puzzling why this lead character got so much support. A much more orchestrated political campaign, I think, in the vein of, for instance, the cleansing of the spiritual pollution campaign that was mounted in the party in 1983, seems, in my view, a much more likely scenario. But clearly, the party center is deeply divided, although the lines of division are as yet unclear, especially when it comes to the position of Xi Jinping himself. So where does he stand, really, in this debate? It seems unlikely that Xi would want a revolution or a cultural revolution. But his earlier views on culture and art nevertheless come close to Li Guangban's, albeit presented in much more measured language. In a speech at the Forum on Literature and Art on 15 October 2014, Xi Jinping deliberately mimicked Mao's pronouncements at the famous forum with the same name in Yan'an 71 years earlier. Like Mao in 1943, Xi denounced the idea of art for art's sake, calling for a people's art and literature that are firmly grounded in reality and closely keep pace with the times. However, different from both Mao in 1943 and Li Guangban in 2021, Xi in 2014 acknowledged the role of the market in artistic production and the need for art to yield a decent return. Although the, again, quote, social benefits should always come first, should they collide with economic results. Moreover, Xi had a clear eye for the impact of Chinese literature and art abroad, impressing on his audience that, and this is a quote, "You are expected to promote splendid Chinese arts globally, introduce foreign audiences to the charm of Chinese culture, and in the course help them develop a better understanding of this culture." So culture is right back in the middle of debates and political struggles about the nature and direction of socialism. But it's a struggle whose contestants' direction and outcome are at present extremely unclear. Regardless of what might happen, party dominance and overall national security have enlisted culture and ideology for the project of making China the great power that the party envisions. Infallible ideological dogma and an excellent culture no longer just serve to carve out a unique Chinese way towards socialism. Culture and ideology have become a matter of comprehensive national security and full party dominance that will never end. But the party's transformation towards full and perpetual dominance does not stop here. Chinese cultural conservatism has gradually become mainstream as a way to build a stable, governable, and cohesive society. Both Chinese culture and socialist ideology have been linked much more explicitly to China's rise and future greatness and the competition with Western ideas and values. China's culture and the socialist foundation of the party have been and are transformed into an alternative to Western liberalism, democracy and human rights, and its spiritual emptiness. China's excellent culture, or China's excellent traditional culture, have become a staple of ideological pronouncements under Xi. The CCP now claims that, quote, since its founding, the Communist Party of China has been a loyal inheritor and advocate of China's excellent traditional culture, and an active advocate and developer of Chinese advanced culture. The Chinese Communist Party's role as the carrier, and thus also the arbiter of traditional and advanced Chinese culture, opens the path-breaking connection with the global order of the past. Particularly in discussions of the century of humiliation, Western dominance in China and the world is portrayed as a temporary blip. China will retake the pivotal position that was historically hers. However, the CCP is not merely assuming the mantle of the old empire. Although not fully mainstream yet, some CCP ideologues have started to claim that China has broken through the old dynastic cycle in which each dynasty eventually succumbs to its internal weaknesses and external threats. The CCP's culture and political innovations and its domestic and international successes, it's been said, lay the foundation for the perpetuation of socialism, heralding in a new era of peace and prosperity that will never end. As I said, this is not mainstream yet, but you see it in articles written by people in the party school system. The legitimacy of the party is thus about much more than just ideology and ideas. The dominance of the party is not just declared and imposed, but is transformed into a truly natural and perpetual state of being. China's excellent culture informs and complements explicitly ideological innovations and organizational strengthening. They transformed the party into a ruling organization fit for China's rising superpower status, away from a performance-based legitimacy that focused on catching up with the advanced nations of the world. Likewise, the ideologically defined goals of socialism and communism are beginning to look outdated and are no longer really needed. In official discourse, socialism and communism are therefore increasingly replaced with invocations of Marxism, which is used as an empty signifier that can endlessly be adapted to Chinese realities. By letting go of an ideologically defined mission, the party has opened up an unlimited array of legitimizing ideas that it can shape in any way or form it wishes, ranging from Marxism to nationalism to Chinese civilization and even to the dynastic rule. Moreover, as a self-acclaimed inheritor and carrier of Chinese civilization, the CCP has usurped the authority to determine what exactly Chinese culture is and what it isn't. This grand project's ultimate aim is to naturalize the party's rule, making it unquestioned and unquestionable. If successful, this will in the long term excuse the party completely from having an ideology, an ultimate mission, or possibly even any legitimizing ideas. If that is successful, then the party will no longer have to be believed, it will simply be believed in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Pieke. I applauded because in this kind of setting, there is no scope for the rest of our viewers, the rest of our participants to applaud, but on their behalf, let me applaud this fantastic lecture which you have just delivered, and thank you very much for it.
You're welcome.
Let me start by one of the things which you said and which struck me greatly was that even in China today, under the rule of the Communist Party of China, there are conditions which could see another sort of cultural revolution being unleashed on the party and on the people of China. Let me ask you to explore that a little more, that concept, that idea. Let me request you to explore that a little more. And if you could let us know, Professor Pieke, whether the probability of such a thing happening is high or is it quite low? So let me start with that, and then we have a number of other questions which I will turn to afterwards.
Very well. Yes, I deliberately use the word cultural revolution because that is, as I said, on everybody's mind when you read the things that Li Guangman says or writes. Li Guangman looks to me like a sort of a fringe member of what is usually called the New Left in China. And the New Left is a broad school of people ranging from mainstream establishment intellectuals like Cui Zhiyuan and others to this Li Guangman. And Li really wants to insert himself in this debate and have an impact by taking a very extreme position and doing, in fact, what more moderate members of the New Left would never want to say, and that is that China needs a new cultural revolution. Li Guangman specifically and explicitly used the word revolution, I think, to get heard, and he's been successful. And I think that many people in the New Left as well are furrowing their eyebrows and trying to think of ways of countering this argument, because that would be highly disruptive. So I don't think that there is a broad constituency in China for starting anything that even remotely resembles a cultural revolution. But by using this word, you create more of a political plank to reinstate some of the political techniques and also the goals, perhaps political goals, of what the cultural revolution purportedly was. And I think that's the objective. The objective is not to rip the party apart, but the objective is to get back to some of Mao's ideas and ideals and put that more squarely into the party's mainstream policy making. To what extent they will be successful is a very difficult question to answer. The New Left and Xi Jinping have a funny relationship. On the one hand, Xi Jinping does need a New Left, and he co-opted some of their ideas and some of their support in his bid for power before 2012. And as such, he needs them, but he doesn't want them to be really involved in policymaking. So he's sidelining them as well. And that's what he does, and that's also what somebody like Wang Huning does. If you want to characterize the regime, it's not so much a New Left regime, but it's more a neoconservative, a cultural neoconservative regime, which is, as I hope I've made clear, is a different beast.
Yeah, thank you. What I would like to do is that there are a number of questions in the chat box, and rather than just reading them out, Professor Pieke, I was wondering if I could call on the individuals to unmute themselves and ask their questions themselves. So there's a wonderful question by Indranil Bhole. Indranil, are you in a position to unmute yourself and ask your question about the CCP's governance and culture, etc.? Indranil?
Yes.
Please go ahead, sir. Please go ahead.
Yes, I have asked the question. Thank you very much. I have listened the lecture very carefully, and I feel there is will the current changes in CCP's governance build up kind of a zombie culture. I mean, I do not mean in a Western sense, but in a Chinese sense, killing innovation in governance, leading to systems collapse. So this was one of my question. I had another question also, a slightly different question. Where do the Taoist and Buddhist strands in Chinese philosophy stand in this new formulation of the CCP? So these are the two issues I wanted guidance from Professor Pieke and from you, sir, also.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Indranil. Professor Pieke, the floor is yours, please.
Sure. So starting with the second one, Taoism and Buddhism are not denounced as much as Christianity by Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping hates basically anything that's foreign. He's a Chinese cultural chauvinist, if you want to pin a label on him. So that makes it difficult for him to oppose Taoism, although Taoism has elements in it that are politically much less digestible than Confucianism. Buddhism, of course, we all know, doesn't really originate in China, right? But nevertheless, it's so sinified that it's considered to be part of Chinese traditional culture. And Xi Jinping is personally quite interested in Buddhism and quite supportive of it. For instance, he supports a very important Buddhist sect, you can call it a cult, in China that has tentacles all over the world and has temples all over the world. And he is their patron, or one of their patrons. But what you don't see is that that is inserted specifically in ideology, in CCP ideology. That is limited to what I call these very anodyne, very sanitized Confucian concepts, which are much more politically useful than ideas about transcendence and all that, that you get from Taoism and Buddhism. The only exception might be a focus on self-cultivation in the creation of a new new citizen, a new responsible citizen. But that again is phrased mainly in terms of Confucian self-cultivation and not in terms of Taoist meditation or Buddhist meditation. Now, about zombie culture, I don't think it's a zombie culture. It is a culture that is completely constructed. But there's nothing in that that says that that should not be, that cannot be successful. And it is, of course, very artificial. It looks silly sometimes viewed from the outside. But when you bang on enough about it, it starts to lead a life of its own. And people start believing it because there are few alternatives available. Look at Singapore, where where constructed culture is all the rage. Constructed Chinese culture, Indian culture, Malaysian culture. It works if you are pushing it enough. But there is a danger, of course, and that is that things like Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism also have a lot of traction independently of the party in Chinese society. And that is something that is condoned, allowed, but how it should or can inform what the party itself does always remains unclear. And that is a very difficult juggling act, because there are Confucian schools and academies set up. There is this Guoxue, this national studies craze that is still playing out in Chinese universities and elsewhere. And these things have to be carefully watched in order that they don't get out of hand and don't start generating ideas that might be heterodox or might even be somewhat subversive. So playing with culture is always a double-edged sword, but I don't see it leading to system collapse. In fact, I see it as a way of shoring up the system and, as I say, perpetuating the system. And that looks like, at the moment at least, like a successful project rather.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Pieke. That was an excellent question, Mr. Bhole, and thank you for that lovely.
Thank you, sir.
There's a follow-up question on, you spoke about the concept of the new left, or you spoke about the new left, Professor. And there's a question from our YouTube channel from Mr. Saurabh Kumar. I assume it's Ambassador Saurabh Kumar from Bangalore. And he says, could you please explain the meaning of the term new left? Isn't it an incongruous term when the essence of the overall economic policy is in the opposite direction? So could you please explain a little more about your concept of the new left, or about the concept of the new left?
Yeah, I see the new left as consisting of two components. The first one is a selection of old Maoist ideas filtered through Red Guard experiences of many of the proponents of the new left. But those elements are mainly important in the emphasis on taking the people's interests at heart, working for the people, fighting corruption, fighting capitalist enrichment and things like that. So this is a social justice kind of agenda. And that is very much part of the CCP's mainstream ideology. Another aspect of the new left, I think we should separate out, and that is, let's say, quasi-Maoist political techniques of mobilization. So criticism and self-criticism of party members, the personality cult around Xi Jinping, the use of also material culture of Maoism, the return to the revolutionary tradition of the party as a legitimating instrument. These are not, in a sense, real in a political sense that they define a particular direction of agenda, but they're used to shore up the regime and the power of its leaders. That's also why I don't think that Xi Jinping's cult is a new Maoist cult. It is simply mimicking what Mao did for the purpose of somebody who, unlike Mao, is fully in power and fully at the center of power. Mao, don't forget, developed this personality cult because he was sidelined within the party center and needed ways to get back in. And Xi Jinping doesn't have that problem. He is right at the center. Of course, he's got lots of enemies, but he's right at the center, and he simply uses his cult to shore up the party and the system itself. So it is system confirming and enhancing rather than undermining the system like Mao Zedong's cult was.
Thank you.
If you want to read about the New Left, there's a very good book by Jude Blanchett on China's New Red Guards, which I highly recommend.
Okay. Thank you very much for pointing us in that direction. Let me ask one other of our younger scholars from the Institute of Chinese Studies who has a question in the chat box. I'm going to call on Shruti to please unmute yourself, Shruti. And if you would like to ask your question directly to Professor Pieke, please go ahead. Shruti, are you being able to? Yeah, go ahead, Shruti, please.
Thank you so much, sir, for that excellent presentation, and I agree with several of your points. So my question is that there is this idea that Deng was able to radically change direction of China's polity as well as, most importantly, economy, because Maoist era institutions were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. But going forward from this, as you said, much more organized and institutionalized centralization of power under Xi, what kind of political reforms do you think are possible now? And are they going to be, is the only way forward more authoritarianism? But if it were not so, who would be the agents of change if there was to be reform in the other direction?
Well, it depends a little bit on what you mean by political reforms. If you mean democracy and human rights, forget it. That's not going to happen. That's not on the cards. Not only just among Xi and his followers, but broadly shared, I think, in the party. Political reform in China is not a term that is used a lot anymore. The terms that are used are more administrative reform or administrative strengthening, enhancing organizational and governance capacity and things like that. So it's all been turned into a very technocratic exercise, with the politics sort of a little bit hidden from view. It's there, but it's hidden under a layer of simply creating a good organization that governs China as best as it can. So what we see now is the buildup of a much larger central governing establishment and structure that is also much more professional and much better funded, and also has created for itself, or has been given, many more instruments to monitor and audit and control disparate parts of the bureaucracy, both in the central bureaucracy and locally. So what you see is centralization and the use of Western management and governance techniques to make the system more accountable and more controllable. That is where it's really going. And it's not going in the direction of opening up, of pluralism, of allowing heterodox ideas in, of democracy. That's all not on the cards. And I also don't see any possibility that Xi Jinping's competitors in the party center, people around Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin's successor, Zheng Qinghong, have enough power to really stop this, and in fact don't have the desire also, I think, to stop this. They would want to have more liberalism, or in the economy perhaps. They would want to have more liberalism in society, but I don't think they want to roll back the party's build-up of its governing capacity. I don't see them doing that.
Yeah.
So little joy, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I think we're slowly running out of time, but Professor Pieke, if you permit me, I'll just read out one last question. Very broadly falls within the ambit of your talk. It's from a person, Nirmal Panda, and the question is, I request if you can focus a little bit on the restructuring of the PLA under Xi's command and PLA's role in upholding the supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party over the life of the Chinese people.
Right, okay. That's an extremely broad question, of course, yes. and way beyond the purview of this particular talk. But I'm happy to say a few things about it. I'm not a PLA specialist, but I know something about it. As the person who asked this question clearly knows, the PLA has been brought back to heel in the last 5 years, starting in 2015, 2016, and has been turned again into a party army rather than a national army. That is the key thing about it. I think Xi Jinping was getting a little antsy about the party's professionalization as being, again, a double-edged sword, that the party, that the army at some point may start thinking of itself as the embodiment of the nation rather than the party being that. And that's, of course, a dangerous thing, not only in China, but in many other countries. The army is always a very dangerous political force. I think that project has been quite successful, but I just read the communique of the most recent 6th plenum, and towards the end there's one really important sentence, that's I think the key sentence, which says that the party, the army and the people should unite more strongly around the central leadership. Now that means currently it is not united around the central leadership, right? So it basically says in the party there are people that are the enemies of the current leadership. In the army there are people that are enemies, and amongst the people, whatever that may be, there are people enemies, and we will go out and get them. That's what they say. I mean, it sounds like a very sort of anodyne, simple thing to say, but that's really the implication. So perhaps the job hasn't been fully completed in the army as well. But exactly how that's going to play out or who it's going to target is something that I can't possibly say on the basis of the current evidence.
Thank you very much, Professor Frank Pieke. There is a formal vote of thanks, but let me thank you on behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, on behalf of this 14th All India Conference on China Studies, for such an scintillating and very, very interesting lecture. It's been a pleasure to be here and to listen to you, Professor. We look forward to greater interaction with you over the coming months and years, and we do hope that it will go from virtual to being physical interaction.
Yes.
If you permit me, I will bring this particular part of our conference to a close and hand it back to the MC for the final thanks.
Thank you, sir. Let me conclude this session by thanking the chair, Ambassador Bambawale, and the speaker, Professor Frank Pieke. I would also like to thank our digital partners, The Print, for covering our sessions. The video recordings of all our sessions will be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We will now have a break of 15 minutes and resume at 5 o'clock for our next special panel on the topic social dimensions and disruptions caused by COVID-19 in China and India. Please note that the meeting room will remain open for the next session. We would encourage you to stay back with the videos and audios off. Thank you.